On October the 1st last year, a professor and 8 of his students were shot dead on the campus of a community college in Roseburg, Oregon. And after this tragic event, as usual, questions were asked about American gun laws, and the opinion was sought of people who at the time were seeking their party's presidential nomination, among them Donald Trump and Jeb Bush. They both said, look, it's difficult to know what to do when such horrible things happen, but look, these things happen. And in May 2014, there was a major mining catastrophe in Turkey, in which more than 300 Turkish coal miners were killed. The Turkish Prime Minister, under pressure because of the government's poor safety record in the mines, went on national television to address the nation and said, among other things, look, these things happen. Well, these are not simply the creation of modern political spin doctors. For come with me to the court of Jerusalem, round about the year 980 BC, and here we meet King David, the monarch of the United Kingdom of Israel and Judah, and supreme commander of the Israelite army. He receives an emissary from his general Joab. The news is urgent, and it concerns the current campaign being waged against Ammon. The news is devastating. Briefly, the Israelite army, together with the cream of its commandos, had besieged the Ammonite capital city of Rabbah. And yet, from an army renowned for its guile, for its sophisticated military strategy, the incomprehensible had happened. Because Joab, instead of seeking out the weakest link in the enemy defenses, had instead thrown the best of his troops into the worst of the fighting, including the highly decorated national hero, Uriah the Hittite. They hadn't stood a chance, and Uriah the Hittite, survivor of many a tough campaign, was killed. Now, arranging a state funeral for Uriah would be the least of David's worries, or so you'd think. But let's just listen to his response to the news that Uriah is dead. It's 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 25. And David said to the messenger, "Thus you shall say to Joab, do not let this matter trouble you. For the sword devours now one and now another. Press your attack on the city and overthrow it, and encourage him. Do not let this matter trouble you." In other words, these things happen. I mean, is that all David has to say? There's no indignation, no summoning of Joab back to court to explain himself, no promise of a public inquiry, simply, these things happen. So, taking our cue from David then, let's investigate a little closely how these things did happen. Well, they happened like this. 2 Samuel 11, verse 1. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab with his officers and all Israel with him. They ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained at Jerusalem. At the time of year when kings go out, the actual Hebrew there doesn't say go out to battle. It just says at the time of year when kings go out. So at the time of year when kings go out, King David stays in. In bed, that is. Verse 2. It happened late one afternoon, when David rose from his couch and was walking about on the roof of the king's house, that he saw from the roof a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. So late one afternoon, David finally gets out of bed. But don't worry, he'll soon be back in it. For he has just seen Bathsheba, and she is beautiful. The same keen eyesight that sent that stone thudding into Goliath's forehead picked out Bathsheba beyond the palace walls. How far do you think that might have been? 100 meters? 120 meters maybe? But even at that distance, David could tell that she was beautiful, worthy of his majesty. Now, to be honest with you, with my eyesight, at that distance, I couldn't tell you whether it was male or female, fish or fowl. But David has the trained eye of the connoisseur, and his eye has passed over a whole bevy of beautiful women. Women such as Michal and Ahinoam and Maacah and Haggith and Eglah and Abital and Abigail. They'd all been David's women, as numerous as the sheep he used to herd. Well, after all, he was king. And as Henry Kissinger once said, the greatest aphrodisiac is power. But as David stands there on top of his palace roof, gazing at the gorgeous, voluptuous Bathsheba, we should perhaps remind ourselves that he is 47. He's 47 years old. He's no adolescent struggling to control his hormones. He's 47 years old, and we say to ourselves, surely the wisdom and experience of middle age will kick in now and common sense prevail. But unfortunately, David has every gift needed except self-control when it's really needed. So, in an instant, he has a plan of action. He sees her, inquires about her, gets her. What happens here is no accident. What happens, happens because David wants it to happen. There's no doubt who's in control. It was David who sent Joab and the army to the Ammonites. It was David who sent servants to find out who the woman was. It was David who sends messengers to bring the woman back to him. That's why these things happen. Because David sends and orders and organizes and decides. David controls everything. Or rather, he controls everything around him, but nothing within him. That's why these things happen. And they happen despite the fact that he knows she's a married woman, despite the fact that he knows she's married to a national hero, and despite the fact that we all know what's going to happen. And it does. We've seen David send this, send that, send the other, and then in verse 5, Bathsheba turns the tables, and we read there that Bathsheba sent and told David, I'm pregnant. Yeah, these things happen. And of course, some things do just happen. Such as the time I preached a sermon on Nicodemus. And throughout the entire sermon, from beginning to end, I called the fellow Zacchaeus. To the complete and utter bewilderment of the congregation. And as I stood at the church door afterwards, shaking hands with the saints, I was only a young intern at the time, the elder came up to me, put his arm around me, said, "Look, don't worry. These things happen." But we are in a different league here. We're in a different league with David, Bathsheba, and Uriah. This is a crisis, and David knows it's a crisis. He knows he's got to act decisively. And just as we saw him before, sending this, sending that, sending the other, David's still in control, sending people. Look at verse 6, chapter 11, verse 6. So, David sent word to Joab, "Send me Uriah the Hittite," and Joab sent Uriah to David. So, we say to ourselves, here is David's opportunity to nip this problem in the bud. What he's going to do, obviously what he's going to do, he's calling Uriah back to Jerusalem so he can sit Uriah down and have a good man-to-man chat with him. He's going to sit Uriah down. Surely this is what he's going to do. He's going to sit him down and he's going to say, now, hi, Uriah. Thanks for coming at such short notice. Now, sorry, Uriah, old chap, but look, we're both men of the world, and well, these things happen, don't they? Now, look, let me assure you that your wife is completely blameless in this affair. She did not initiate this. She did not encourage me. I was the one who took advantage of her. And look, surely we can come to some arrangement. Look, next time they're discussing promotion in the army, I'll drop a word in Joab's ear. Well, that should do it, you'd think, because after all, Uriah is a Hittite, not an Israelite. He'll take the hint. But unfortunately, David knows that Uriah is a man of integrity. And any appeal to self-interest is going to be water off a duck's back as far as Uriah is concerned. No, David is going to have to be crafty here. What David needs to do is to get Uriah to go down to his house and spend some time with Bathsheba as soon as possible. And when you read the story, as a typical Old Testament story, you discover at no time does the Bible ever tell us, why does David want Uriah to go down to his house and spend some time with his wife as soon as possible? But we know. So, plan A. David greets Uriah as a fellow man of the world, and he says to him, beginning of verse 8, David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." I need to explain something here. We had something similar in the story of Ruth and Boaz, so I might as well spill the beans here. You know, the Old Testament normally calls a spade, but not always. And in the Old Testament, the word feet is sometimes used as a euphemism for other parts of the human anatomy, if you get my drift. Come on, Uriah. I mean, how stupid do you have to be not to see what I'm getting at? Well, Uriah isn't stupid, but David will have to try better than that, because we're told explicitly that that night Uriah chose to sleep in the servants' quarter in the palace, and explicitly he did not go down to his house. You read that in verse 9. And in the next morning, he explains to David, to an amazed David, why he didn't go down to his house. Verse 11. Uriah said to David, "The ark and Israel and Judah remain in booths, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Shall I then go to my house to eat and to drink and to lie with my wife? As you live and as your soul lives, I will not do such a thing." So says Uriah, how can he enjoy the comforts of home and Bathsheba's warm embrace when his colleagues are roughing it out in enemy territory? Come to think of it, David, how can you? And another thing, David, why does it take a Hittite to remind you about commitment, faithfulness, and integrity? So then, it will have to be Plan B. Plan B is a palace party in which Uriah's glass is filled as soon as he's drained it. David gets Uriah drunk. Alcohol will soon get rid of his principles, David thinks. But we're told once again, this is in verse 13, Uriah still did not go down to his house. Why? Because Uriah drunk has more principles than David sober. And that's a great pity, Uriah. That's a great pity, Uriah, because it means it will have to be Plan C. And Plan C could have been avoided so easily if you'd just pushed your principles to one side and gone down to your house. So the plot is hatched. Ruthless and callous, Uriah must die, and other people will have to die too if this is going to look like an accident. But Joab will take care of that. And while Uriah is on his way, and you'll notice in the story that David has handed to Uriah his own death warrant to give to Joab so that he can be killed. As Uriah is on the way, holding his own death warrant in his hand, let's reflect for a moment or two on why these things happened. They happened for the same reason they happen in our world, in your life and in my life. Uriah dies because David wants him to die, because David has plotted and calculated and schemed his death. There was nothing inevitable about any of this. This whole train of events could have stopped the moment David saw Bathsheba. He could have looked the other way, but he chose not to. When Bathsheba sent David the message, "I'm pregnant," David could have said to Uriah, "Look, Uriah, we need to have a chat, mate." But he chose not to. And when Uriah repeatedly refused to go down to his house, David could have said, "Okay, Uriah, clearly you're a man of greater integrity than I. Look, it was like this." But he chose not to. And when David sees Uriah holding that death warrant in his hand, riding out through the palace gates, David could have said, "Stop!" But he chose not to. And because he chose not to, we read this, verses 16 and 17. As Joab was besieging the city, he assigned Uriah to the place where he knew there were valiant warriors. The men of the city came out and fought with Joab, and some of the servants of David among the people fell. Uriah the Hittite was killed as well. Up to this point in the story has been told without any spare words. We've just marched on without any deviation. But once we get to the death of Uriah, the story slows right down. Our storyteller tells us things we already know. He repeats things he doesn't need to repeat in order to delay and delay and delay David's response to the news that Uriah is dead. So that when we get to David's response, the storyteller is saying, dear reader, please take note of this. You've arrived at the climax of this story. Verse 25. David said to the messenger, thus you shall say to Joab, do not let this matter trouble you, for the sword devours now one and now another. So we arrive at the point where we started. These things happen. Actually, if you were to translate literally from the Hebrew what David says, what he says literally is this: do not let this matter be evil in your eyes. Do not let this matter be evil in your eyes. The very last line of this story, the end of verse 27, very last line of it, it says, but the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. If you translate that literally, it is the thing that David had done was evil in the eyes of the Lord. You see the contrast? David, do not let this matter be evil in your eyes, but the thing that David had done was evil in the eyes of the Lord. In other words, when David says, look, don't worry, these things happen, God says, no, they don't. They don't just happen. And it's never the fact that injustice simply just happens. In this story, we see injustice for Bathsheba, who is seen, got, used, and abused. There's injustice for murdered Uriah, whose loyalty David just throws back in his face. There's injustice for those troops who had to die in order to make it look like an accident. This is a story of injustice from beginning to end. And all of that injustice, every bit of it, every last scrap of it, the sexual exploitation, the adultery, the murder, the scheming, the barefaced lies, is dismissed by David with a wave of his hand. Don't worry, these things happen. And that's a common response, I think, of many of us, I include myself there, when we perhaps tune in and look at the news, world news, with its catalogue of injustice, whether it's, as we saw, relief agencies being bombed in Syria, people trafficking in Eastern Europe, bonded servants being hardly better than slaves in parts of Asia, simply as a coping mechanism. We sometimes, I think, say, well, these things happen. But those examples I just gave might appear to be a little bit distant. The problem is that we keep tripping over injustice in our everyday lives, even when we don't recognize it sometimes. I mean, take me as a typical Western consumer. When I hear that still a fair proportion of the world's chocolate production is still dependent on child labor. Or when I learn that 20% of the male workers on banana plantations in Ecuador become permanently infertile because of the chemicals used in banana production. Well, I say to myself as I bite into my chocolate chip banana muffin, do not let this matter trouble you. Do not let this be evil in your eyes. These things happen. But if there's one thing the story of David, Bathsheba, and Uriah tell us, it is that, generally speaking, such things do not just happen. They happen either because we want them to happen, we don't stop them from happening, or we simply don't care. David said, "Don't worry, these things happen." God said, "No, they don't. They don't just happen." Not with David, Bathsheba, and Uriah, nor with us.